it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Before I do that, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Colorado sits upon land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people, and to further acknowledge that there are 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Zelikova, who is joining us today to talk about her very interesting work. Jane is an ecosystem scientist whose work connects climate change, science, and policy. She grew up in Ukraine and moved to the United States when she was 12. She's a Boulder alum. She earned her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from CU Boulder in 2008. Is that right? And has since worked across the western United States and abroad to examine the effects of global change in both natural and managed systems. She is currently a senior scientist at Carbon 180, a nonprofit organization that brings together scientists, policymakers, and businesses to fundamentally rethink how we're approaching today's carbon challenges. And she's also co-founded 500 Women Scientists, which I think you'll be talking a little bit about today, and Hey Girl Productions. And so it's really a pleasure to have you here. We'll leave about 10, 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. So thanks so much Jane, for being here.
And before, thank you for the acknowledgement of the land acknowledgement. That's really great, and I love when that happens. And also, I do want to apologize. I did definitely show up to the wrong location, but I'm here now, and I will value your time and make sure we have time at the end for questions. So before I start, I want to introduce myself also and provide some context for me as a scientist and as a human. So I am one of the co-founders of 500 Women Scientists and a filmmaker, but I also am like a human. I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a partner, I'm a dog mom. I hope that I'm a good friend. Sometimes I ski, sometimes I climb. Sometimes I binge Netflix. I am an imperfect human, and I want to bring my humanity to my talk today. And that's me doing field work, because biogeochemistry sometimes means having to dive down deep holes in soil. And so, to frame my talk with you today, or to frame our conversation, I want to really frame it into thinking more about a new kind of climate leadership. So this is a piece that my colleague Gianna and I wrote. Gianna is the co-founder and managing director of Carbon 180, the nonprofit that I work in. And she and I and others at Carbon 180 have been grappling with sort of doing climate work and climate change research and policy and advocacy in a space where we see the same kinds of climate leaders. And they're often not people that look like us. They're often older, white, and male, and those perspectives dominate the climate conversation and have dominated a lot of the conversations around solutions. So we wrote this piece to really think about and pull into question what kind of climate leadership we're really seeking, who are the leaders today, and who are the leaders of tomorrow that will actually help us address the challenge, and making sure that as we build a deep bench of climate expertise and climate leadership, that bench doesn't look like the people that are in positions of power today. So that will be kind of the framing for everything I talk about. And so just really quickly, I have a PhD in ecology from CU Boulder, and in my PhD was a really great opportunity for me to grapple with really complex systems. Ecology is all about understanding interrelationships between plants and organisms and microbes and how environmental factors influence those relationships. So it's a really great framework for tackling a problem like climate change because it is so integrative. And it's not just about the carbon molecules in the atmosphere, it's also about humans and how our actions affect those carbon molecules, and it's about our economy, and it's about how we make decisions. And so I think a PhD in ecology was actually, in retrospect, the perfect PhD for me. It wasn't, I wanted to be a president of a company when I was little or be a National Geographic explorer, so this wasn't always a clear path for me, but I'm so glad this is where I ended up. And in my PhD work, and since then, I've really been thinking about integrative questions, so like not focused on any specific system, but more thinking about how systems work and how they work under climate pressure. So I worked in tropical forest, I worked in grasslands. This is a picture of a phase experiment I worked on near Cheyenne, Wyoming. I worked in the mountains and thought a lot about dust deposition and snow hydrology. I thought a lot about cows. Cows dominate my brain space in a way that I could have never imagined. But I think a lot about how ranchers and the decisions that ranchers make influence carbon and have the potential to be part of the climate solution. I think a lot about ants. I have a really big project I'm wrapping up on leafcutter ants and how they influence the carbon cycle. And so I've also worked on things like cheatgrass and biological soil crusts. So the system is, I like everything, and I have serious FOMO when it comes to science. But I'm working really hard at focusing, and in fact, being late today is a perfect example of my inability to focus. So just being honest about that. And so I think ecology is this really great framework. Not that I'm trying to sell it as a discipline to you, but if you're an undergrad in the room and you care about climate change and you want to figure out how to get engaged, ecology, I think, could be a really great place for you. And also, ecology of late is a lot of like traditional scientific. Well, it's more like the way we think about science today, but ecology also has like a long history of traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge. So there are these opportunities to find other ways of thinking and other ways of tackling problems. So really like it. Oh, and you get to do field work if you're. I mean, I think most ecologists get to do field work, and that is really fun. So I don't want to dismiss the fun. And so framing all of the work that I've done, including the work that I do at Carbon 180, is thinking about the interplay between these three big factors. The fact that global processes are changing, climate is just one of the things that's changing. The other things that are changing is people are moving around a lot, species are moving around a lot. A global change factor that maybe isn't included often, but is in fact a really big deal, is invasive species spread. And just changing the dynamics of natural systems with new players in the mix. And I also think a lot about ecosystem services and processes. So there are all these things that we get from ecological systems. And in our very like transactionally focused world, it's all about what we get. Often we don't think a lot about what we give. But I think in the climate change conversation these days, ecosystem services is starting to take a bigger and bigger space in the room, and people are trying to think about how to harness ecosystem services and carbon sequestration and marketize it. I don't know if that's a word, but create markets around it, sell it, give people money, continue to engage in the capitalist system. So I think it's really interesting to understand that interplay and also interplay between these factors and policy management, how the decisions that we make and the policies that we support both benefit from the knowledge created in the other bins and also influence the work that we do. And I got to put the ants in there and the microbes. All these things are important. And so I've done a lot of climate change science, but this isn't going to be one of those talks where I show you lots of graphs for my research. I can't remember the last time I read a paper that I wrote, and I can't remember the last time I wrote a paper, actually. So it's been a while. But what I've been thinking a lot about since about 2015 is how to put the climate change work that I'm doing into an application context, make it actionable, make it accessible. And I will say, like, that thought started permeating my brain when I was at CU and finishing my PhD in 2008. And then I put it on hold because inertia is a strong thing, and there was all this inertia for me to keep being a scientist and do research and do postdocs and get grant money and write papers, and I did those things. But this was always in the back of my mind. So how do we put the knowledge to work, and how do we ensure that the solutions to climate change that we come up with don't perpetuate the same harms in the same systems that got us into this mess in the first place? And I will just say the second question is a really, really hard one, and it's one that we grapple with at Carbon 180, at 500 Women Scientists, in every aspect of my life, all the time. And there are no easy solutions, but I'm going to force us to keep coming back to that because it's really important. And so in order to start like doing this work and trying to figure this out, I applied for a AAAS fellowship. AAAS stands for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they do this thing where they let scientists like me come to DC and spend a year doing science policy work. It's awesome. I first applied in 2008 as a naive, brand new minted PhD, and they were like, no, you don't seem to quite have your act together. You don't know what you're getting into. So I reapplied and got accepted in 2015. So I got to DC, was really excited, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, And I was thinking, like, where could I do the most good? So as part of the process of getting a AAAS fellowship, you have to do a bunch of interviews across different federal agencies. And I had an interview, my last interview of the week during interview week was with the Office of Fossil Energy at the Department of Energy. Could not, and I was like coming from Boulder, could not have found a place more different ideologically than me. And it made me uncomfortable the whole time. I had an hour-long interview and I was uncomfortable the whole time. And I was like, okay, there's like something to this. I feel like viscerally upset and uncomfortable because we're talking about it's the office of coal, essentially. And I was like, this is a place where I can bring my expertise. They've never had a fellow. It could be really great for me to learn a lot. It could be great for them to have a liberal Birkenstock wearing person in the office for a year. And I did wear Birkenstocks, FYI. And so they like accepted me, which I thought was really awesome. So I spent a year and a half at the Office of Fossil Energy, the first year of which was under the Obama administration and the last 6 months under the current administration. And I focused a lot on thinking about how to decarbonize the fossil fuel sector. And everything I thought about the Office of Fossil Energy was wrong. It was a place of a lot of science expertise and a lot of passionate people working to make the world a better place. And specifically focusing on thinking about how do we tackle these like systems that are embedded in everything that we do. Like I just got a ride here because I was running late. My husband came and got me in the truck, giant truck that he drives, and dropped me off. Like these are things that we have to grapple with. And so one of the big things was to understand how carbon capture and utilization works. How do we tackle, like, if we move everything to electricity, it matters how we generate electricity, right? If we have electric cars, it matters how those cars are powered. And if you're plugging in your car at night, you're probably powered by coal because 50% of our electricity mix today is coal, right? So, like, all these things matter, and I was really naive about them, and I learned a lot. And the other thing that I learned is that policy is really about translating science. It's about taking these, like, important things that we learn in our academic work and research work and translating them for actual use, which takes a little bit of effort and some practice. And it's also about building relationships. Policy is about who you know. Folks that work in politics and policy, it's not the same as like, in science, it's sort of like you are the expert, so you automatically get a place at the table and an opportunity to speak and a leadership position in certain contexts. In politics and in policy, if you've been there the longest, you're in that position of power. So it's a very different dynamic, and it was important to understand that to be effective. And the other thing that I learned is that it was important for me to know that I knew nothing about economics, and that economics literally was the most important thing that I should have learned. Because in the end, federal policy is about understanding how we, the federal government, spend money. And so starting at the Department of Energy and continuing into my work today, I've really been thinking about the carbon challenge. And so what is the carbon challenge? Well, we have a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and we have some pretty ambitious climate goals we're trying to achieve. And a lot of literature that I read looks like this. And so this is essentially saying the carbon law is that we have to reduce our CO2 emissions by half every decade so that we can meet the goal that we've set for ourselves by 2050 and be on a trajectory to reduce warming to a reasonable amount, which is 1.5 to 2 degrees. And to do that, there are all these different pathways to get us there. And if we electrify our transportation, and if we, essentially kill coal and reduce natural gas, and we do all of these things, we still don't reach our goals. That carbon removal, actively taking carbon out of the atmosphere, is going to be an increasingly important lever for us to address the challenge. And so in the absence of other alternatives, and I will say, like, I'm always open to the idea that there will be an amazing discovery, and that we will have an alternative. We will have some other solution that is not part of the portfolio today. But given what's in the portfolio today, we have to do technical and natural CO2 removal, and that has to scale to 5 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050. 5 gigatons is a lot of CO2 to remove. And so what do we have? Like, what are the tools at our disposal today? A lot of folks spend a lot of time thinking about renewable energy, and I love renewable energy. And then in terms of, engineered solutions, there are all these opportunities to think about hybrid systems and what the world could look like in the next 50 years, where we have renewable energy that's embedded with, let's say, a power plant that is continuing to use natural gas to make electricity, but that the CO2 from those plants are immediately captured on site, and the renewable energy is used to run a process that takes that CO2 and makes something out of it. Let's say sneakers or carbon bikes, carbon frame bikes, or whatever the thing is that we have to build a market for. The other thing that people are really getting excited about, and I have a lot of thoughts about, is the direct air capture machines. So essentially it's like an HVAC system that pulls CO2 through it. There are fans and they have a membrane. The membrane has an affinity for CO2 molecules, grabs it, sticks to it, and then heats it up, compresses it, and pipes it. This is a picture from a Climeworks one in Switzerland. That was one of the first commercial ones to be built. And what they're doing is piping CO2 to nearby co-located greenhouses where the CO2 is being used to help grow tomatoes and lettuce. So really this is just a halfway house for CO2. It's going to go back into the atmosphere. It's not actually a carbon removal solution, but this is a way for us to test an idea, mess up, learn from our mistakes, and figure out how to do it better. Eventually what you could envision is maybe buildings that have direct air capture machines on their ceiling, on their roofs, and that the carbon dioxide that is captured is let's say compressed and put into a pipeline as part of put into an HVAC system as part of the building's cooling and whatever infrastructure, and then connected to a pipeline for CO2 that's collecting from all the buildings and putting it into a geologic reservoir. I mean, the level of ingenuity needed here is big, but we get to have an imagination and be visionary right now, because we need everything. And the other thing is we need a lot of infrastructure. So if we're going to make this stuff happen, we have to think about rebuilding our whole society in a different way. But I live in a world where technology reigns supreme and everyone's really excited about technology, but technology is not going to be the solution to the problem. And I'll just say, because the Carbon 180 is based in the Bay Area, people get really excited about technology because it's an easy thing that they can feel good about. But it's not going to be, people are not quite grappling with the idea that technology is also part of the problem. And so in thinking about carbon removal in my work and at Carbon 180 more broadly, we're thinking both about the technological solutions that are needed, the carbon capture, carbon utilization, carbon storage, and we're also thinking a lot about what natural systems can do. So this is a picture of, for example, microbes and roots that can help sequester carbon in soil. And so natural solutions are really exciting, and people in the last couple of years have gotten super pumped about soils and maybe have over-touted the potential for soils to be a climate solution. I love this work because this is my research, so this is what I've been engaging with the most. And this is a paper from Griscom et al. In 2017 that looked at all the different climate solutions that are nature-based and estimated their potential to mitigate climate or remove carbon from the atmosphere. And then they've also looked at the cost. So how much, is it going to be $10 a ton to remove, $100 a ton, or some other amount? And then also whether there are other co-benefits like potentials for clean air, biodiversity, improving water, and improving soil. And one of the great things about natural climate solutions is that they have so many co-benefits. You can see for most of the solutions under forests or under ag land and wetlands, they come with all these other benefits. So it's rare in this climate space to have any kind of a win-win. It's especially rare to have a triple win. And I feel like climate solutions that are based in nature have a triple win opportunity. Most of them are cheap. They're under $10 a ton. We don't have to invent a new technology to do it. We know plants photosynthesize. If we plant more trees, they will draw down carbon from the atmosphere. Soils have microbes that do a great job grabbing carbon and holding onto it. We don't have to invent a technology. People really want to invent a thing and then sell it into a market. This is not a sell into a market situation necessarily, and I found that people are both excited about it and uncomfortable. And I think that's a good space. I've learned from my fossil energy work, that's a good space to be in. And so some of the key things that people are thinking about when they're thinking about soil carbon sequestration and more broadly natural climate solutions is understanding who the players are. So the key protagonists in the space are farmers, ranchers, or folks that are managing land. It's also policymakers and civil society, NGOs like the one that I work in. It's also folks that are in the supply chain. So Walmart has been playing in this space. General Mills has been playing a lot in this space. These like big companies that are starting to think about their supply chain and their customers and what their customers want. It's also folks in finance. So the way that we finance soil health today is problematic. There are no federal loans that support farmers implementing new practices. So a farmer has to risk a lot to be able to do something new, and there's no federal loan guarantee to help them pay for that, right? So like finance has a big role to play here, but there's also technical assistance in science. If we're going to be doing these new things, we have to be measuring the outcomes so we know that we're moving in the right direction for climate. And I think it's a really important place for folks that are science-minded and care about policy to engage. And also there are lots of international processes that are really important for this, that are pushing these solutions across the world, not just in the US. But I will say what happens in the US really matters. And so there are lots of practices that fall under these different categories, and I'll talk about those in more detail. But the main thing is that soils regulate the terrestrial carbon cycle. So they both emit carbon and they store carbon. So they're this major lever that we can pull if we pull it right. And the things that we can do to soil to improve soil carbon sequestration are planting perennial crops or cover crops, rotating crops, doing conservation tillage or not tilling at all. We can also improve rice cultivation practices and reduce the emissions of nitrous oxide and methane. And we can also improve how we graze cattle on our land. And I think like it's great to think about not eating meat at all, but in reality we have to improve how we graze cattle because a lot of our ecosystems actually evolve with grazers and do much better when they are grazed on some sort of a cycle. And so I think a map is always just a visualization of opportunity. And as we think about the world, we can think about where we grow crops. So whether that's cropland or pasture, we can see that in the U.S. we have a lot of land where we're doing agricultural management, and that's essentially a template for where we can have an influence. And in 2018, the IPCC released their 1.5 degree report, and they looked at under different climate scenarios how different crops were going to be doing. And the main thing to take away from this is that essentially like the growing season length and the success of many of the crops that we rely on are going to be changing under climate change. And most of them are going to be essentially reduced in yield. So we're having to feed a growing population under more strenuous climate conditions, potentially under drought or more climate variability. And so we're expecting crop yields to go down, even though there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, which CO2 is the sort of the engine that runs photosynthesis. And so thinking about that, there are some opportunities to think about where we can increase yields to help address the growing population challenge. And one of the ways that we can do that is implementing different kinds of farming systems. So focusing on building better soils is a really important lever. There's a lot of high-tech systems, precision ag, that people are really excited about. Again, people love technology and they really want to develop an app. But the other things that are easier is just doing carbon farming practices. Essentially, those just mean don't disturb the soil, plant things in rotation, and pay attention to your soil. So, and we have lots of area for improvement. So if you think through like where we're growing a lot of our major commodity crops across the Midwest and some in the South, we're growing them for food, but one thing people don't talk about is a lot of what we grow we actually use for fuel. Essentially, a lot of corn is being used to create ethanol. Ethanol is a fuel additive. And so we can improve agricultural practices and continue to produce both food and fuel if needed. But it's important to understand where those opportunities are. And so I never miss an opportunity to quote Wendell Berry. And I'll just say the soil is a great connector of lives. the source and destination of all. It's the healer and restorer and resurrector, by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. So I love that we can start with soil. It's like, it very much fits my ethos and like what I want to see in the world. And it's also an opportunity to engage farmers and ranchers who've been for far too long left out of the climate solutions tent. And on top of that, we've lost a lot of carbon from our soils. So this is a paper that Jonathan Sanderman published in 2017, where he used empirical data and modeling to essentially show that we've lost a lot of carbon from soil from agricultural and land use practices. And so that, he estimated 133 petagrams of carbon. I'll just say side note, petagram as a unit is difficult. But it's a lot of soil that we've lost, and I think it's kind of our soil debt to pay. So it's an opportunity for us to improve how we manage soil and the benefit of sequestering carbon. And in the US, there are some areas of high where we can store a lot of carbon and areas where we have less potential. So blue areas is where we already have a lot of soil organic carbon, and those are opportunities to improve that. And then, of course, like where we are, we have carbon poor soils, but we can improve and grow. Even from 1% to 2% is 100% improvement in terms of soil carbon stocks. And thinking about that means we have to think about how we manage land. And so this is a map that the USDA produced where they've looked at how we are using our land and what share of that is being used for grassland, pasture, or rangeland, cropland, forest, or some other use. And in the West, it's a lot of grazing land. And if you've driven across Colorado, you've seen a lot of grazing land. But it's also quite a lot of cropland in Colorado and forest land. And the tools that we apply to those land uses are different. So it's important to understand how we're using land so we can pick the right tool for the job. I'll just put another Wendell. So I'll leave that one up. It's just Wendell Berry had a lot of great things to say about. And the great thing is, like, soil health and soil carbon have been they're kind of the rising star in the climate space. People are getting really pumped about fostering soil health because it's kind of like an opportunity to engage in a bipartisan conversation. Unlike other things in the climate space, soil health continues to sort of have bipartisan support. And everybody wants to help farmers, even though they're 1% of our population. They are punching above their weight. They have a lot more power politically. And so Nerds for Earth is this volunteer effort, if you ever want to volunteer your time, to essentially help bring analytical science and coding expertise to help solve the climate crisis. And they've just developed this tool that's the State Healthy Soil Policy Map, where they're essentially going through every state and looking at which states have soil health policies passed, where those conversations have started, and then where folks are not really talking about this. In Colorado, this is in the interest space. There are folks meeting every month as a loose coalition around soil health, and that includes NGOs, scientists, policymakers, and producers, and they're talking about what a soil health bill in Colorado could look like. So when that formalizes and they draft something that'll go into legislation drafted, I'll just say there are a bunch of states that have recently passed legislation and helped producers sequester carbon. So it's a very rapidly moving field. Just a couple of years ago, it was just one state. So there's like so much opportunity here to think about, and there's a lot of need for science. So for example, New Mexico just passed a new healthy soils bill, and now they're in the place where they passed it. They were like really surprised that they were able to do it. And then they all of a sudden passed it, and they were like, oh crap, what do we do now? We don't know how to roll this out. So there's rulemaking happening to figure out how do we roll this out, how do we pay people for carbon they sequester. And when you start talking about how to pay people for carbon, you have to figure out how to measure carbon. And that is where science and policy meet. And there's all kinds of like great opportunity to bring sanity into a really confusing conversation. And there's also lots of opportunity for scientists to learn about the policy process. So that's kind of where I've been at, is helping New Mexico and other states figure out how to measure carbon in a way that isn't too onerous for producers or too challenging for the sort of the policy side of things, but that actually is robust and rigorous, so that we actually are tracking outcomes over time. And so to kind of wrap up that piece, so I can spend the last 5 minutes chatting about 500 women scientists, I would say in all of my science and policy work, communication has been the key thing, and science has been the foundation. So in every conversation that I participate in, I'm often the only scientist, and until recently, often the only woman. And so science is foundational, and evidence-based policy needs science. So like if we're not in the room, oftentimes science doesn't become part of the conversation. So it's really important for scientists to engage, and I guess that's my like little do it. And then the other piece is that science needs to tell its story better. Right now, the way the public views science is like very disconnected from how we as people in science engage with it. And often there are perceptions that scientists are, I've written this, so I'll say it, old, stale, and male. And that isn't my reality, and that isn't the reality of the rising kind of group of scientists that are coming online and getting really excited. So we need to tell our story better, but we also have to grapple with some of the very like problematic issues in scientific institutions, and we have to rethink how we do science and what it means to be an expert. And so for the last 5 minutes, I'll just talk about, or the last 10 minutes, I'll talk about the fact that we're never just scientists, and that we come to science being human beings with lots of different dimensions and identities. I came to you today, I'm a woman, I'm an immigrant, I'm a Jew, I'm heterosexual, sometimes that matters. I'm very privileged in a lot of ways because I'm white, and even though I'm an immigrant from a different country, dropping into this country with white privilege has given me a lot of opportunities that other immigrants haven't gotten. So it's important to acknowledge who we are when we come to do science. And the other thing I want to point out, and this is just, sometimes you Google things, and this is just a little Google search that my friend Miriam and I did recently, where we typed in greatest scientist of all time, and we got this, which is great. It's important to acknowledge the people that have done, that have built the scientific framework that we engage in today. But there was only one woman pictured in this whole thing, and most of the people here are white, and to be very honest, European. So this is where we are. This is like Google, Google knows. And so the question that I want to ask myself and I want to ask you is how we can serve society. Our role as scientists is to serve society. By the way, I don't know if you knew that. That is our role. It's not just a selfish endeavor. But how can we serve society or the public if science doesn't look like the public? And I hadn't been able to formulate that question when I was going to undergrad, and I hadn't been able to formulate it when I was in grad school. And then when I got to DC, but it was like in the back of my mind, and when I got to DC, I was just like, oh my God, the disconnect is so huge. The rooms that I'm in are so dominated by white people and so dominated by men. And that's not the public. Over 50% of the public is actually women, or people that identify as women, or a broad spectrum of genders, actually. That's something I'm learning about. And so we have a long way to go, but the first thing is to acknowledge that this is problematic. And I don't know if I have time. I really want to show this, so I'm going to do it, and I'll skip other things. Because I just really want it to happen. It's just so inspirational. Oh, there it is. Okay. Wait, I figured it out, but it's just tiny. Wait, can you see me doing things? Mm-hmm. Okay. Hold on. I'm sorry. This is going to happen. Sometimes you just really want a thing to happen. Because this video makes me cry, and not that I want you to cry, but
If you're not on the wireless, you can log in as wireless guest or UCB guest.
Okay, I think it's working. Oh,
A second. There it goes.
there it goes. All right. And also the sound.
Do this so good sound.
Oh my goodness, guys. I can do this. It is often the case that technology beats me, but not today, technology. Not today.
You can plug
Oh.
that short.
That's okay, but that is not going to get in here, is it?
That's not the volume one. No.
What if we just turn up the volume on the TV?
Yeah. I
It
think,
should work.
okay.
Is the remote over there?
Yeah, to your left, Franks. Okay.
We can do
then
it.
we can do this.
Okay, let's
Okay.
see. Oh, no. All right, well.
Here you go. Looks like the volume.
Turn out the volume on your computer.
Like on the actual video. So.
It's on the screen, it's just.
On the bottom of your display, you can increase the volume extension.
It's not showing it up.
On the right side of the tape.
Oh,
That's the.
Right there. A little to the left. There you go.
okay, we're going to do this again now that you're familiar.
Yeah.
The TV won't.
Okay, it's happening.
There's
When I was young, I fell in love with this world. I fell in love with the silence of the desert, the smell of the earth rain, the plains of South Dakota. I fell in love with the way that the world holds us. I am a climate scientist. I am a Palestinian Texan in all around general narrative. I am an immigrant, an advocate. I'm a leader. I am a black girl from the hood who's trying to change climate policy. When I look around today, I see a lot of brokenness, corruption, divisions between the haves and the have-nots, living footsteps of the planet fraying, and I feel worried about our future. I feel grief. I feel ashamed, really angry, heartbroken, numb. On good days, I feel courageous. To me, the climate crisis is an economic issue, an immigration issue, a spiritual issue, a feminist issue, a right now issue, the ultimate intersectional justice issue. I'm determined to be part of the solution because I want there to be children on the planet for 7 generations. Because everyone has a role to play. Because it's the right thing to do. It's easy to imagine a future that is bleak. I can also imagine transformation. People rising in resilience. 100% clean energy farms that sequester carbon in their soil. A world that is inclusive. A future that works for all of us. I am a woman. I'm a woman. I am leading on climate. We are leading on climate. Join us. Join us.
Worth it? I don't know. I think it was worth it.
yeah.
Where would we find that if we wanted to see it?
I can send it.
I just
It's
found it easy search. Just Google when you find it and it's got it in
Yeah.
email.
The URL is on the slide also.
oh no. Yeah, I put it in the presentation too, so. And I love that because it makes me cry, so that's good. And it's just nice to like think about who the leaders of tomorrow are, what they look like, what they bring to that conversation. And I think like women leading climate, it could be what a huge opportunity, right? It's not to say men don't have a role to play, but that all like we need to think about a different kind of leadership. And it could be really cool to like, I don't know, it opens up possibilities because women bring something unique to that to that conversation and the fight, and I'm excited to see things change finally. It makes me feel really happy. So thinking about how far we have come, it's not far. Women make up only 28% of researchers worldwide. Apparently we leak. Apparently there's a leaky pipeline out of which people like me have been leaking out because I'm not engaging in academic pursuit of research. People are writing a lot about leaky pipelines and thinking about plugging the hole. I didn't realize that I was leaking out of a hole. So there's this conversation happening, but what I'm excited about is that it's happening in the public and we're finally having the conversation. If we don't have the conversation, we can't change anything. And so it's important to take a look under the hood of our scientific institutions and critically, we are evidence-based people. We're supposed to value critical thinking. Well, let's do it. There's institutional discrimination. White men get paid a lot more than Asian women, white women, black women, and Latina women. I mean, Latina women make half of what a white man makes for the same damn job. That is not cool. There are gender norms that are keeping women from succeeding. There's inadequate family leave policies. If women have children, their earning impact goes down by 100% relative to men that have children. Like, that's not fair. There's workplace harassment, there's discrimination, there's gender discrimination, there's racial discrimination, there's the stuff of like actual sexual harassment. There was a report published by the National Academies that essentially gave a really big platform for having an honest conversation about the deep issues. Science is only second to the military in the level of sexual harassment that is reported. The military, we're second to the military. Just saying. So I think when it comes to sexual harassment, academia is fundamentally broken, and we have to fix it. And so 500 Women Scientists is an organization I started with a friend. We are solutions oriented. We are fighting males. We're sick of being at conferences and seeing all male panels. No more. We're not taking any excuses. We've created a database. You can go find a woman scientist on any topic, any level of education, anywhere in the world. I don't want to hear any excuses. We're launching a fellowship for the future to reward women of color for the work they are doing, often unrecognized and unpaid, making science more inclusive and more equitable and just. We're going to give them money and give them opportunities and support them in that work. We are highlighting women scientists on our platform every week. We have organized pods all over the world, chapters that are everywhere, almost everywhere. So these pink flowers are 500 women scientist chapters across the world. We have 400 of them where women scientists are coming together and essentially pushing for scientific institutions to be better. And we're just getting started. We are celebrating our 3rd year this week. We started the night of the 2016 presidential election in the US. Turns out the issues that we were upset about are actually global. And so the whole thing took off like wildfire across the world because it's not, white nationalism, white supremacy, racism, patriarchy. These are not just US issues. And we're working to fight all of those things. So I'll stop there and I'll answer questions. I think I went over by 2
minutes. My name is Fernando Briones. I'm affiliated here at CSTPR. Thanks for your inspiring talk. I'm a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist, and I have a hard time to integrate my experience and interest in this conversation. How do you see the role of social scientists and social science in these topics?
In the climate change topic or the gender?
In the climate change topic.
Okay, so I actually have come to realize that none of the work that I do matters if I don't engage with social scientists, because there's a deep scholarship around these issues of how humans interact with new ideas, with new technologies, etc., that has been largely ignored in the climate space. And so one of the things that we've been doing at Carbon 180 is essentially holding these sort of policy science workshops where we bring together, I don't know what to call us, the non-social scientists with social scientists. I don't want to say hard science because that's not fair. To essentially have these conversations. Like, for example, I met Leaf at 1. And that is informing all of our work. So, for example, a year ago, thinking about accessibility and whether climate solutions are accessible and scalable for everyone, wasn't really part of our work. And now, like, climate justice is a critical, like, foundational piece to everything that we do. And that's because of our interactions and work with social scientists. Not everyone's doing that, but I think it's, like, starting to happen.
Thank you for your work and your inspiring talk and all the things you're doing. I just wanted to pick up on your soils work that you were talking about. And I wanted to kind of actually also picks up on the social science question. I did some work about 10 years ago. There's a lot of interest in, and I think you're absolutely right, politically getting farmers, ranchers into the conversation about climate is through soils and the work they can do. And I did some work, like I said, quite a while ago, and it sort of indicated it was harder. The potential's there from a physical point of view, but the real potential has to do with, I mean, we already have land ownership completely settled in a sense, not settled, but every piece of land you might want to store carbon on, somebody already is doing something on it already. And the challenge seemed to be, like you mentioned, economics, like cost, transaction costs, how difficult it might be to change patterns or just the bookkeeping around, getting credit. I mean, this excitement, like in the 2000s, 2008, 2009 was really mounting, and it dropped off because I think there was sort of no way to make it work. And I'm curious what the space is like now for these opportunities, because I really do believe it is a good thing, to build up carbon in soils and also to bring the folks into the conversation. But I think it's critical not to just think of it as biophysical potential, but as like actual social potential. Like, what are the actual mechanisms to get people who manage the land actually to be able to do this?
Yeah, so really good question, something that I think about a lot. I'm gonna say, side note, at my work, if you say the word blockchain, you have to do push-ups. So I'm gonna do push-ups later because I'm doing this now. There's all this interest in trying to monetize carbon transactions, but in a way that is more transparent. So there are all these new companies that are interested in helping measure, track, and monetize carbon sequestration through the blockchain. That's 10 push-ups. And it's a really interesting space because on the one hand, it's like applying a new tool to a challenge. On the other hand, there's very little critical assessment of what it means to engage in that platform. And while transparency is good, like, there are other problematic issues, and it's still part of like a capitalist system. So, like, am I advocating for moving away from capitalism? Maybe. But the other thing is, like, the pieces of it that make it scalable for people have to do with education. So one of the big things that we've been pushing is like more NRCS technical assistants and staff that are trained in soil health at every regional office to be able to support farmers and ranchers who are interested in learning what to do, improving measurement platforms so that it's accessible and easy to track carbon over time, and then getting a bunch of companies to be the first buyers so that the market can actually take off if we're going to engage in a market, which it looks like people will. Markets happen, y'all. You got to be careful. If you're not careful, markets emerge. So there's all this stuff happening, and so there's like the education, technical assistance, and I think the science piece that have to all come together. So, like, just saying sequester carbon but give no tools and no incentives and no financial support, and it doesn't work. I agree with you. Uh-oh. This is going to be a hard one.
No. Well, yeah. Thank you, though. It was a really great presentation. So I have a challenging question that someone asked me that I didn't have a good answer to, and so I'm going to ask you. And it was, I guess, kind of bringing together a couple of points you made about the underrepresentation of women and minority groups in science and in climate science in particular, but then also the point you made about policy really being deciding how to spend money. And so the question is, if you had to put a price on underrepresentation that you were going to use to justify policies to correct that, how do we think about the really concrete cost that you could give to a skeptic and say, because we don't have this representation, like, here's the economic cost, or here's the sort of demonstrated social, political, scientific cost of not having the representation.
I mean, I'm so glad you asked me that super easy
It is a
question.
hard
Initially, my gut reaction is like, I don't want to monetize what is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But if we must monetize and must give evidence to people who are skeptical that the right thing to do is the right thing to do, then I think there are some really awesome examples, especially recently, of policies that fail, climate policies that fail when marginalized communities are not engaged early and often. So for example, the Washington carbon tax, policy was largely a fail because of environmental justice and climate justice issues, and that lack of engagement. So you could probably do a back calculation to see how much did all the advocacy around that issue cost, how much is going to cost to do carbon abatement without a comprehensive statewide carbon policy in place, relative to what it would have cost, which they know they did projections on, to implement the policy and what the benefits are. And you can maybe use the social cost of carbon as a metric to benchmark against. Again, I'm not an economist, but I think that could be one way that you could show that this costs more. That's not ideal, and I could think about it more. I mean, the other thing is you have, 90% white male-dominated decision makers making decisions for a diverse set of stakeholders, but only representing a very specific, when that happens, technological solutions tend to be the ones that go to the top. They get the most financial support, so you could look at financial support that technological solutions receive relative to other solutions, and then where the cost of the public health costs of implementing solutions in places where marginalized communities bear the brunt of it, right? So Cancer Alley, anywhere that you have refineries. This could be a big project for someone.
I think we may have time for one very short question to wrap up.
You had a question, I think? Was it the same
Not a
question? You had the
short
same question?
No, it's a different question, but I'll ask it if there's time allotted. So the question is scale. Can you compare the potential to store carbon in soils versus the potential to store carbon by changing fuel sources or geologic storage or carbon utilization for products?
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies that have looked at this, lots of them. I think agricultural or general carbon sequestration in soils could maybe remove 10% of what needs to be removed. It's not the big lever, but it is the most accessible, immediately scalable, and cheapest lever. That was actually easy.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for being here.